Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing a pretty interesting question. It was just about a year ago where I had made a video discussing whether or not the San Jose Sharks should trade Tomas Hertl, and my general conclusion from that video was that yes, the Sharks should part way with their centerman, who was to be an unrestricted free agent at the end of the season. Now, this didn't end up happening. The Sharks would sign him to an extension, but now this year, I want to make a similar video about a player who's in a relatively similar position, not exactly, but kind of close, and that is talking about whether or not the Sharks should trade Timo Meier. Timo Meier has been a player who has been somewhat in the rumor mill over these past couple of years, not so much this past season, but prior to that in the 2021 and 1920 years, because of his slight decline that maybe he wasn't actually working with the San Jose Sharks. In particular, one team that was really rumored to be in the market for Timo Meier was actually the New Jersey Devils, potentially because of the Swiss connection that there was between Timo Meier as well as Devils centerman Nico Hischier. Obviously, those two players played a lot together internationally. However, with the fantastic 21-22 season that Timo Meier had, the rumor mill had kind of slowed down, but since the San Jose Sharks are still in a sort of rebuilding type of retooling phase, and it's unlikely that they manage to make the playoffs this season, the big question is whether or not the Sharks should yet again extend a player onto a large, probably like 7 or 8 year contract, like they have done so many times where they maybe have not worked out as much. So let us talk about Timo Meier, because first of all, what would he actually end up signing for? It's actually kind of complicated to find out. Compared to Tomas Hertl, Hertl had kept a pretty consistent pace over the past few years, really only seeing a slight downturn of points, but that was likely correlated to the fact that the Sharks generally was just playing much worse and were less strong offensively, and so his contract was actually not too difficult to predict. When it comes to Timo Meier, it has really been not just a tale of 2 seasons, but a tale of 4 seasons over his past 4 years in the NHL. In 18-19, it was his breakout year. He was kind of overshadowed by a couple of the other Sharks players like Pavelski, Hertl, Brent Burns in a year that the Sharks made it to the Western Conference Finals, but yet still, he had 78 games played, 30 goals, 36 assists for 66 points, which over an 82 game pace, which is not that far, he'd have about 69 points. And this was a fantastic season, and at the end of it, he would sign a 6 million per year contract with San Jose, which was regarded as a pretty big steal for the San Jose Sharks, and around the league was even regarded as one of the biggest steals of the entire offseason, not only because of the strong point totals he put up, but also because he was a bit of an analytical darling. His advanced stats were very strong and strongly pointed towards him not only keeping up that performance going into the next season, but potentially even improving on it. And so having Meier for $6 million over the next 4 years was looking like an absolute steal for San Jose. But 1920 saw a slight regression, kind of one that is similar to what I mentioned for Tomas Hertl, that you could sort of attribute to the fact that the Sharks were generally worse this season. 70 games played, 22 goals, 27 assists for 49 points over a full 82 game season. That would see him put up about 57 points, which is not too much lower than what he had in the previous season, about a dozen points, but like I said, you could correlate to that to the fact that the Sharks were just generally much worse. So not an awful season from Meier, but definitely not the type of step forward that you were expecting, and now his $6 million contract that was looking like a steal was looking a bit more on average value for the San Jose Sharks. And it did not get better in the 2021 season. In fact, it actually got worse. It was a shortened year of only 56 games. Meier played 54 of those, 12 goals, which only put him on pace for 18 on the year, 19 assists for 31 points, which was just honestly quite disastrous over an 82 game pace that wouldn't have even hit 50 points. So suddenly you could no longer give the excuse that the Sharks were just generally worse. Meier really did see a big decline in terms of play. So now it has gone from being a steal to really not even being worth the $6 million that he was getting paid. And so heading into the 21-22 season, it was really a big question mark what the Sharks would get from Meier. Would it be the the 2021 Meier, not so fantastic, not even a 50-point type of player? Would it be the 18-19 Meier, an analytical darling who could get close to 70 points on the season? Or would it be the somewhere in between 19-20 Timo Meier? Well, actually, it did not end up being any of those three positively here for the San Jose Sharks, as he managed in 77 games to put up 35 goals, 41 assists for 76 points, just barely coming in under the point per game mark. It was an absolutely dominant performance on the year for Timo Meier, perhaps one of the most dominant performances we've seen from a San Jose Sharks over these 4 years that Meier I'm outlining here of 18-19, 19-20, 20-21, and 21-22, really only up there with like Tomas Hertl in 18-19 and perhaps like one other performance. So it was extremely strong for Timo Meier. He was essentially single-handedly carrying the offensive load for the San Jose Sharks. And what's actually most interesting is this was probably the weakest that the San Jose Sharks top six had been over this 4-year period, because of the fact that Evander Kane, of course, did not play at all that season because of the drama with him off of the ice. So at the very least, they had him for that 2021 and 19-20 season. This year, it was basically Timo Meier, Logan Couture, Tomas Hertl, and whoever the Sharks could actually else fit in to that top six. And yet Meier still managed to have a career year, fantastic advanced stats as well. And this really sets him up in a pretty interesting spot going into the final year, where once again we are left with massive question marks of what exactly we are going to see from Meier, which makes it extremely difficult to actually predict what his next contract could be. So for the sake of this video, we are going to have to make the assumption that I'm at least going to say that he is going to exactly repeat what he did this past year. So we are going to assume for this video that he will once again score 35 goals, 41 assists for 76 points over 77 games, or of course the 82 game pace for that. This is because, like I said, very, very difficult to predict. And if we don't actually do that, it's very difficult to say what we're going to actually see. This is probably also a major reason why there hasn't actually been any sort of extension talks between San Jose and Timo Meier's camp for trying to get a contract ironed out here. It's just so difficult to actually come to the table and really put up an ask if you are for Timo Meier, or an offer if you are from Mike Grier's side, because you really do not know exactly what's going on. If you base on the first 2 years of his contract, you probably don't even give him that much of a raise over the $6 million he's making. But if you base it just on this third year of his deal, the year he just played, suddenly he's in line for a pretty decent raise. So assuming he does put up an exact same season, how much would he actually end up getting paid? Well, let's look at a somewhat comparable player who did sign this past offseason, and that was Matthew Tkachuk with the Florida Panthers. He got traded from Calgary to Florida and then signed a $9.5 million per year 8-year deal with the Florida Panthers. Now, there are a couple of caveats to that. While Tkachuk was normally putting up seasons like what Meier did this past year, this season for Tkachuk, 21-22, was extremely impressive, where he scored over 100 points. So that clearly gives him a bit of a raise on the contract, even if it's not necessarily expected that he'll be able to keep that up for the rest of his career. On top of that, it should be noted that the Florida Panthers do have a bit of a tax haven going on in their situation, where Florida does not actually have any sort of income tax. And so in comparison to a team like the San Jose Sharks in California, you might be able to get a bit more of a favorable deal, which could go to explaining for why teams like the Tampa Bay Lightning are also able to get certain players for contracts that might seem slightly below market value. So that also may have deflated Tkachuk's contract. And so I would put the 9.5 that Matthew Tkachuk made as the hard cap ceiling for Timo Meier, unless he vastly overperforms this upcoming season. I would also likely put a bit of a floor for him if we assume he repeats what he did, of about $8 million, which is what Couture and Tomas Hertl are making. I doubt Meier ends up coming anywhere below that. So the question is, will he equal what Couture and Hertl are making, or will he become the highest paid forward on the San Jose Sharks? Honestly, It's kind of a bit difficult to say because Hertl does have the advantage of being a centerman, which is obviously valued higher by NHL brass compared to Timo Meier, who is a winger. However, I do think Meier's ceiling, as we've seen this past season, is actually slightly higher than Tomas Hertl. On top of that, Meier is actually a good bit younger than Tomas Hertl as well, which means that you are getting more prime years from Meier. However, you might also be thinking, well, is this really the exact same situation? Hertl was an unrestricted free agent. Timo Meier is a restricted free agent, and this much is indeed true. However, the reason why the San Jose Sharks were able to get away with such a steal of a contract back in the 18-19 off-season was because of the fact of the way it was structured. You see, at the time, at the very least, the way restricted free agent contracts worked is that by the end of it, when you would have to give that restricted free agent a qualifying offer, you have to give them 100%, at the very least 100% of the money that they made in the final year of their contract. And this Timo Meier deal was constructed in such a way that Meier would get paid $10 million real dollars in the final year of that contract. And so if the Sharks were to give him a qualifying offer, they would need to pay him a full $10 million to do so, which Meier could very well just accept right away. And that would put the Sharks in a bit of an awkward situation. This is technically no longer the case. Any contract signed, I believe, by 2020 now has the option of also giving a qualifying offer based on 120% of the cap hit, which in Meier's case would have been $7.2 million. But since Meier's contract was signed before 2020, this doesn't actually apply here. And so Meier is actually in a pretty decent position where he does have rather solid negotiation power because of the fact that he could otherwise just take either a $10 million qualifying offer from the San Jose Sharks or become an unrestricted free agent if he is not offered that. So pretty solid situation for Meier, which actually puts him at a similar level to Tomas Hertl in terms of negotiation tactics. So in the end, because I feel as though Meier has a bit of a higher ceiling than Tomas Hertl, even if he is in a slightly unfavorable sort of spot, being a winger compared to a center, I imagine he'll get slightly more than what Hertl ends up getting at around 8.25, maybe going as high as about 8.5. Again, this is assuming that he puts up an exactly equivalent season as he did this past year in 21-22. Having said all that, let's now talk about what exactly a Timo Meier trade might look like. When I was discussing Tomas Hertl, I had mentioned that it was likely in the Sharks' best interest to trade Tomas Hertl at the beginning of the season because of the fact that that would allow whichever team that would be receiving him to have a full year with him, would make him a bit less of a rental, and so the Sharks could get more value. This isn't necessarily the case with Timo Meier because of the fact that his value is still likely not at his absolute peak because of the inconsistencies seen in his game. Is the team going to be trading for Timo Meier and get the 21-22 version of him, or will they get the 2021? So there would likely be a bit of hesitation for teams looking to trade for Timo Meier, which means a trade at the beginning of the season might not be in the Sharks' best interest. What would be, if the Sharks really wanted to move on from Meier, would probably be closer to a trade deadline deal. He has a pretty favorable contract that won't be too difficult for teams to fit in, and on top of that, he wouldn't even necessarily be coming in as a full rental because of the fact that he is a restricted free agent. Yes, there is the qualifying offer situation that I mentioned earlier of having to give him the $10 million that a team probably won't actually be able to fit in, but still, he isn't by definition a rental player like it is for most unrestricted free agents. And so I think the Sharks could actually get pretty good value from him at the trade deadline, likely very similar to what I had predicted the Sharks could have gotten from Tomas Hertl as well. You know, a first round pick, a very good prospect, and maybe a couple of other aspects if the Sharks add in something of their own as well. Having said that, in the end, the real deciding factor that I had come to when it was coming to the discussion of whether or not the Sharks should trade Tomas Hertl was mostly his age relative to when the Sharks would be competitive again. I had calculated that since the Sharks were unlikely to be competitive over the next couple of years, that by the time that they actually were looking to be a playoff team once more, Hertl could very easily be 32, maybe even 33 years old, which doesn't really fit in line with the Sharks' competitive window. Compare that to Timo Meier, who is currently still only 25 years old, turning 26 at the beginning of this upcoming season. When the Sharks are competitive again, he might only be 28 to 29 years old, which is still on the strong side of 30 and still fits into a much more competitive window. And so having said this, even though I had said the Sharks should trade Tomas Hertl, on the other side of the coin here when it comes to Timo Meier, because he is younger, I do think that the Sharks should retain his services and should look to sign an extension with him. Class dismissed.